think I don't know how many times I've been interviewed over the years, but it's been a lot. And after you do a bunch of them, you sort of get a feel for who's really on their interviewing game. And these were just both times. I just absolutely loved being on with Corey. So I'm like, hey, you're really good at this.
How many interviews have you done in your business?
So it's currently over 7,500. What we launched 4.5 years ago is a thing called Blue Talks. So Blue stands for Business Life Universe. It's BLU. And I say if Chicken Soup and TEDx had a baby, we'd be the baby. Well, one of my big questions I've asked thousands of times, literally, is what I call the time machine question. I think it's an important question, is how do you schedule the interviews in the first place? So to you guys, congrats and kudos, because again, 3 times in almost 20 years, I've been asked a similar question to this.
Hey, Launch family, before today's episode, I have a small favor to ask you. We realize not everyone who's watching our show is subscribed to the channel. So if you've ever learned anything valuable from our conversations, or if you felt inspired by one of our guests, can you do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button? It helps grow the show more than you know. And the bigger the show gets, the bigger our guests will get. Thank you. And here's today's Dare to Launch. Hello, Launch family. This is Dare to Launch. My name is Chris. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Mr. Jeff Walker.
Hey, everybody.
And today we have a very special guest for you. He's a 5-time TEDx speaker, a Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author, a Success Magazine emerging entrepreneur, a yogi. You'll have to ask him about that. Rock Recording of the Year nominee, and a retired stand-up comedian. Really a man of many different backgrounds. Welcome to the show, Corey Poirier.
Thank you both. I am super stoked to be here.
Super stoked to have you here too. And Jeff, you've met Corey a couple of times, right?
Yeah, Corey's interviewed me 2 different times for other podcasts, for his podcast. And, I think I don't know how many times I've been interviewed over the years, but it's been a lot. And after you do a bunch of them, you sort of get a feel for who's really on their interviewing game. And these were just both times. I just absolutely loved being on with Corey. So I'm like, hey, you're really good at this. And then he got to telling me just how many interviews he has done. And I'm like, we should get you on just to talk about this, about interviewing people. And so that if you have a podcast, this will be great for you. If you're doing case studies, this will be great for you. If you just are interviewing experts to increase your domain of knowledge, this will be for you. So Corey, I'm looking forward to this.
Me as well.
Well, and just to give people perspective, how many interviews have you done in your business?
So it's currently over 7,500. And
wow.
When I say the number these days, it shocks me to hear the number out loud. Just kind of a backstory really quickly as to how the numbers got that high. I started out with a little newspaper that would be like Success Magazine, but for a small community regional type paper. And to put it out every month, we had like 70, 80 pages. So I had to do almost 100 interviews a month. And we ran it for 7 years. So that's how the numbers got up so quickly. And what it was is I would do the interviews, but then I had freelance writers to write them, because otherwise I would never be able to do it all. But clearly I get obsessed with interviewing people, or I would have passed the interviewing off to somebody else, and I didn't. So when people sometimes go, how is 7,500 even possible? And I know some broadcasters, they have done like 20-some thousand, but it's because of all those interviews I started with gave me a head start.
Wow. That's fascinating. Could you give us a highlight reel of just some of the biggest interviews you've done? Because you've interviewed some big people, not just Jeff, by the way.
So top of mind, I won't give a story for each, but I will say one of the most fascinating ones was Robin Sharma. For those listeners who don't know who Robin is, he wrote The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, The Leader Who Had No Title, and I think 10 other international bestsellers. And I had to interview with Robin with a toothache. And that was a new one to me. So basically, the only way I could soothe the toothache was if I was drinking water. So by the time I was done with the interview, I needed the bathroom more than I've ever needed a bathroom in my life. So that was maybe one of the more unique ones. But over the years, I've had the opportunity and been blessed to interview everyone from Nichols to Les Brown to Chong, Deepak Chopra, Muriel Hemingway, the actress, Dave Hester from Storage Wars, if you guys remember. Yep, that guy. Brian Austin Green from 90210. And yeah, it just Darren Hardy from Success Magazine. Zig Ziglar before his passing. Very unique one, though, because we had to actually do it via phone and email because he had lost his short-term memory by that point. And that was an amazing interview, even having his daughter afterward tell me they were trying to figure out what the legacy of the Ziglar brand was going to be. So right before that started and Tom took over. And, so I've had the opportunity to interview some of these people that I watch from afar that have impacted my life in the biggest of ways, including Jeff, by the way.
Yeah, I saw you also interviewed Bob Proctor, I believe, too. And you two got into a discussion about Napoleon Hill that I thought was really interesting. You mentioned to me that sometimes you get compared to Napoleon Hill. Why is that?
Well, it's been media especially. And I believe it really comes down to how many people I've interviewed. But it's not just the numbers. Napoleon Hill, I've heard different numbers. And Jeff, you may have heard more accurate ones than me. But I've heard numbers like 500 people he interviewed that were multimillionaires of the 30s. And then I've heard a lot higher than that. But whichever way, it was a big number. I think the comparison was because the reason for my interviewing, I had it posted everywhere, is I wanted to dissect the minds of thousands of thought leaders so you don't have to. And I believe that's what Napoleon Hill did. So it wasn't just the amount of interviews as much, I think, as it was the fact that I was searching for what are the common and timeless secrets of these influential leaders.
Well, let's get into it because I want to hear what you've learned about interviewing and really because interviewing is its own skill in and of itself. I think you'd agree with me on that one. What have you learned about really drawing out the best in people when you interview them?
I feel one of the things that you can do, I mean, there's people that obsessively research, like, Tim Ferriss obsessively researches, Lewis Howes, I believe, still does. But for me, so it depends on the person. So if it's a person that there's not much of a way I could find unique things about, then I come in just like a blank slate. But the ones that I've been able to make a really big impact is when I love and or know their work already and or do some research. So to give you a random example, Stedman Graham. So a lot of people would know Stedman as a major influencer. Also, a lot of people know Stedman because he's partners with Oprah Winfrey. But when I was interviewing Stedman, I did some research and I found out that he had been involved in a charity that he decided to close down years earlier. But I had to dig to find it. And so I said to Stedman, tell me about the charity. And I listed the name and he said, whoa, who told you about that? How'd you hear about that? And it became a thing where this is something he's never talked about in probably 15 years. But where that came from, Chris and Jeff, is doing research beforehand. So I already knew the basis of his work so that I could have an interview where I could say, remember when you said this, or remember when you did that? But then at the same time, I did extra research to find out something unique that he hasn't shared before. I think it's that. And also I try to ask questions that are pretty deep and questions that usually bring stuff out of people because they haven't been asked that question before. And sometimes that happens with a question that you think, of course, they've heard it before. So I asked Neil Donald Walsh, who wrote Conversations with God, how he defined success. And he said, wow. And he's got a very dry humor. He's 80 and he's got a very subtle dry humor. So you don't know if he's joking or not. And he said, defining success. He said, in 25 years, I've never been asked that question. And I thought he was pulling my leg because that's a question I've been asked many times. And he said, no, I'm serious. Once I started laughing, he goes, I've never been asked that question before. So sometimes it's a question you don't expect. That was a leading question to ask, maybe a deeper one. But going back to full circle to answer the question directly, it's doing research, being interested in the person beforehand, knowing a bit about them, and kind of seeing where that leads us. But yeah, it's deep questions and doing research.
Research is such a general term, I find, right? Like, could you get a little deeper on that for us? Because, you could read someone's book or you could Google them or you could look at YouTube videos. Like, what is research? And we all have limited time. So like, what is your, some hacks around doing research in the most effective way to get that gold?
So there's a couple of answers to that. In one hand, the books, usually, if it's somebody I've wanted to interview, I've usually read their books. So like I've read Launch multiple times. I've used Launch from the book and bought into Product Launch Formula as well. So that's a scenario where I know it, not inside out, but I know it enough without doing research into the book. Then there's the other side where I just mentioned with Stedman. So where I found that info was on his Wikipedia page, but I go to the point where most people don't go. Meaning some people go to Wikipedia and say, personal info, career, what have you, but I try to scroll every aspect and pick out some nuggets that you won't see elsewhere. Then there's the side of, because of the amount of interviews I've done, if I'm going to interview somebody like, let's say Bob Proctor. Now, Bob has passed a couple of years ago, but the guy that was working with Bob that was part of the connection to him was a guy named John Tallarico. So John knew Bob quite well. And so I might say to John, hey, I'm interviewing Bob. What's something I should ask him that he's told you that you don't think anybody else has heard? And so it could be a connection that I have that gets me that insight. And then the other side is, it could be like, so Chicken Soup for the Soul with Jack and Mark. I did some research, and I didn't know this until I did a bit of, and this was Google, a bit of digging, but I found out that they didn't own it anymore years ago. And everybody I talked to thought they still owned the brand. They had sold it. So I talked to Jack and I said, what were the unique parts of selling the brand? And Jack and Mark were known for tithing. So, give a percentage from every sale. And so he said that obviously carried on to selling the company. You have to give a percentage now of the sale. And he said he wrote the biggest check he ever wrote in his life that day. And he said he was shaking because he had never written a check that big. And he said he sent it out to the universe. He knew he had to do it. And I think it was the next day he got an overseas booking that paid him back more than that big check that he had just written. So I say this all to say, again, research, it was me digging through Google to find out that they didn't still own the brand, which I thought they did. I mean, for many years after, their names are still on the books. So it's really a unique situation. But I thought, if most people don't know, if I didn't know, and I know them, their business quite well, if I didn't know that they don't still own this brand, I bet a lot of people don't. So, it goes back to that. What can I pull out that makes them talk about something that they've never shared before? And then, so the research side for me is a mixture between Google, Wiki, so Wikipedia. It's also a mix between knowing them sort of already and having read often their books. And then it's also, who do I know that knows them that I can ask them some information? And then the last piece, because you mentioned being so busy, sometimes what I'll do is, if I know somebody like a Tim Ferriss who does a lot of research, has interviewed them, I'll listen to that episode and I'll see what Tim's asked them to make sure I don't ask them that question. But it also tells me, okay, he's asked them this question, which they said they never were asked before. What's a similar question to that one?
How about AI? Are you using AI now to help research?
I'm going to say the answer is yes. I would. Let's say 3 months ago, I'd probably say no. I'm just getting my feet wet right now. I kind of held out a bit longer than most, but I've started to use it. And I've been using just the Chat GPT. Like, I know there's all kinds of AI coming out now that's maybe even more advanced than that, but I've been using Chat GPT to search them and see what kind of info comes back. The one thing is, I find, depending on who the person is, sometimes it's very vague. And also I've seen times where there's some parts that aren't accurate. And why I say that is, I realized, hey, maybe I should Chat GPT myself. And it came back with some very vague stuff. And there's a couple things that I wouldn't necessarily call accurate. So yes, Jeff, I use it, but I also have then go and match it to make sure I find it one other place.
There's a quote, I think it's from Barbara Walters, where she talks about how whoever's asking the questions is always in control of the conversation. And I wanted to ask you, what makes a great question for an interview?
I feel what makes a great question is a question that, again, we go back to the point of, it's not something that's asked often to people. And so if you can come up with questions that are deep, so deep to me is a great question, but something that's not asked often, but it depends on the goal, right? Because some interviewers, the goal is to get you to say something that you haven't said so they can use it against you, or to maybe bring it out to the world that this person said this and got a gotcha moment so it gets more clicks. For me, a great question is a question where me and the interviewee are both at ease. We're both on side, but they understand that I'm trying to bring this out of them because it'll impact other people's lives. But, I think in a lot of these cases, it's probably better for me to give you a specific example as well, Chris, because again, when you asked about research, I gave a whole bunch of different routes, like 5, but it was partly because I realized we're all busy and some people might resonate with one versus another. But as an example, one of my big questions I've asked thousands of times, literally, is what I call the time machine question. And so, and you know what, I find there's some people that do ask this question. I've heard other people ask it. So I know some people have been asked it, but it's one example. And so I would say, if you could jump into a time machine and go back and talk to a younger Chris and give him some life advice based on what you've learned in the years since, what would you say to him? And so that's the question leading into it. But then you're going to give me an answer. The answer could be, I wouldn't get in the time machine. The answer could be, I would go back and say, you're doing a great job. The answer could be, I would say, don't date that girl. Whatever it is, it could be a different answer. So then I'm going to go from there. So it's a leading question that's very open-ended, but I'm going to go from there based on what you answer. That's where I'm going to lead. So for example, if you say, well, I wouldn't want to change anything, so I don't think I would say anything, or whatever that looks like, I would say, would you get in the time machine? And then, so I can go from there. So now, and then that's the second question. Then I might have a third based on what you answer. Would you get in the time machine? Dr. Joe Vitale, when I asked him, he said, oh my God, he said, I bought a time machine off eBay. I would be in that time machine before you could turn it on. And you don't expect that answer. So that's going to bring me in a different direction. But now another example of a question that's like that I ask is, so my newest book is called The Enlightened Passenger. And so the book itself is about two strangers on a plane. So a follow-up question I might say is, look, now, we've talked about what you would tell your younger self. This question might seem similar, but it's actually quite different. What I want to know is if you sat down next to a stranger on a plane and they leaned over and said, hey, Jeff, I need some life advice. What do you got? What would you tell them? And of course, the difference is it's a stranger who you don't know versus your younger self who you know quite well. Those are two questions I ask. And one of the two of those, I'll have people say right in the interview, oh my gosh, I've never been asked this question before. So they're pretty deep and they get you thinking and reflecting. And by the way, when I said about that time machine, I could go off that question for 4 or 5 questions. Like I could say, well, if you would get in the time machine and you didn't want to go back and talk to your younger self, which part in history would you go back to and why? So I hope I'm explaining that well, but it's like deep questions. Or like legacy. What do you want your legacy to be? That's a really big question. I find a lot of people ask surface level questions, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but they might ask a question like, if they're talking to entrepreneurs or startups, what's the toughest challenge you ever faced? And that's still, that's still going to bring out probably a deep answer, but it's a question I'm sure that's asked from podcasts around startups every single hour of a day somewhere. So I try to come up with questions that I don't think people are used to hearing.
How do you think about this, or do you think about like the sequence? Corey, I'm all about sequences with the launches. The sequence or the overall structure of an interview, because like I would think for most people, you're not going to want to go to a super, super deep question like that right off. So do you sort of go into, is it just I have this experience, I've done this thousands of times, I know how to get into this, or you sit down and say, for this interview, I think this is my overall map?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because I started in a different way than I am now. So I started, people always say to me, how do you get better at interviews? And to me, it's like anything else. You put in 10,000 hours and you'll get better. And so when I first started, John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneurs on Fire was starting around the same time. And so John, I was out about 6 months before John, maybe a little more, which is early in the podcasting world. In fact, when I started, we called it, we were on Blog Talk Radio, and it was like online radio. We weren't even saying podcasting. And so I started around the same time as John. And when I started, I was like, what structure do I use? And I would have these questions. And then I watched what John did, and he would have like 10 questions, and it's always the same. By the way, to this day, he's changed them slightly. I've been on 4 times, and the questions are very similar. Now, mind you, if you're on talking about different things, I would take the answers in different directions. But he had the same questions, and that's his sequence. So he has now John's from the military. He's very structured. He had a sequence. For me, when I started, I had that sequence, Jeff, and it would be like, I usually say, tell us a little bit about yourself versus like I usually don't these days. I don't read a big bio, for example. Like I feel I'm going to get the names of the universities wrong and everything else. So I'll say, I have Jeff here with me. And Jeff, usually where we like to start is we like to get you to tell us a little bit about yourself. And then so the start, Jeff, to lead people in is let's talk about you. And then you'll say something in that. And this is my sequence. You'll say something in there that, again, is not going to be super deep, probably. Like it's not super high level. And that's what I'm going to jump on. So you might say, like we talked earlier in my bio, that you perform stand-up comedy. And let's say I had no idea. Then I'm going to go there. Well, that's obviously still not going super deep yet. So I'm going to try to build the relationship, especially the first interview. I'm going to try to build the relationship and follow with, again, I don't want to call them softball questions, but very light questions before I build a legacy or success, or if you had to do it all over again, like those deep ones. So at first it'll be like, tell us about yourself. And then, oh, that's fascinating that you did that. What got you started? Why'd you do what you do? And so there is a sequence, absolutely. But to answer your other side of it is something I've been doing for a while. So I think the sequence is very organic, but there is a sequence. You're right. The only exception would be is if somebody said you got 5 minutes, ask your questions. Actually, a great example is Gary Vaynerchuk. So I did an interview with Gary, and I had like 3 minutes. They said you can ask 1 or 2 or 3 questions. And I knew if I tried to ask 3 questions in a minute and a half, 2 minutes, I wasn't going to get enough of an answer. So I went right in for the time machine question. That was the only question I asked. And so that's pretty deep. And he goes, wow, that's a deep question to start with. And I'm like, well, it's the only one I got. So that, and by the way, that the reason I partially did that question is I'm thinking repurpose is we're working on a time machine documentary now, the time machine question, because I've asked it so many times. And so I jumped in, Jeff, to that one. So there's no sequence because the whole thing was only 1.5, 2 or 3 minutes or whatever it was. And so if I have time, which to me is like at least 30 minutes, then I'm going to lead in softly and build our way up to a deeper question. If I only have 3 or 5 minutes, I'm probably going to have to dive a bit deeper.
So interviews can be really interesting because you've got, how do you stay present so that you can react to what is being said while you still have that plan, while you still have that great question? You know this follow-up question, but you don't want to be thinking about that follow-up question because you want to be focused on your guest so you can really be with them and react to them. How do you, it's a bit of a mind game there.
So I'm a Gemini, and I often wonder if it's like I have 2 twins, the two twins operating at the same time. So I have like the multitasker and the person that's the analytical person. So on one hand, I learned early on that I have the ability to do those things, like have one thing in the back of my mind. But the first thing I do with that is I push it back there, meaning I know I'm going to ask it, so I don't focus on it. So if it was the time machine question, I know I'm going to ask it before the interview's done. And it could be the next question coming up. I know I'm going to ask that, so I try to push that out of my head and focus on what the person's saying. I really feel the best way to do it, though, because not everybody's going to have that. Like I have the photographic memory, which makes it really good for interviewing. Like I can remember stuff that Jack Canfield said to me 4 years ago. I can remember stuff you said to me literally from our interview. And so that's a great thing I have. But if not everybody has that, I think the other option, you got to get slightly better at interviewing or get doing it a little bit more often so you can work on the fly. Now, I also have a stand-up comedy background, which helps as well. But I really think the one thing you can do, because I like strategy, the one thing you can do as an actual strategy is start getting in the moment, meaning meditate or whatever it takes to get you so that you can live in the moment. And I know that's a big statement, live in the moment, like the power of now is really big. But I really feel you have to get to a point where you get comfortable enough with the interview that you don't have to worry about thinking about that question over and over again. Meaning, first of all, I've done it enough that I know the questions are going to come out whenever they're ready. But secondly, I think you got to get good enough in the moment that you can be comfortable being there, present with the person, and figuring out the rest as you go. Because otherwise, if you get in your head with that next question, you're not even going to know what they said. And sometimes what's going to happen is you're going to say, "Oh, that's a great point, Jeff." And you might have asked me a question. So it is. I mean, we are in this world now where we're all multitasking at a high level. We're on our phone going, yeah, oh yeah, that's true. And so to your point, to do a good interview, you have to find a way to be there in the moment. So I record every interview that I do via video purposely so the person could see if I'm doing something else. Because what I found is if I turn it off and go audio only, I have the temptation to get distracted. Because nobody's seeing me and I think, I can still juggle it and I shouldn't be. And so video keeps me accountable. And then the other thing I do is I do meditate. I do some things that I feel keep me present moment. And by doing that, I can just stay in the moment. I think the one other thing is I've learned over the years that, in my opinion, the journey is really the destination. So I've had to get out of this whole idea of I need this, the only time it matters is launch day. Like I know there's a lot of people, like they get a book in their hand and they're like, when the book's in my hand, I'll be happy. And then they get the book in their hand, they go, okay, what's next? And so they never really enjoy the journey or the destination. So I had to start realizing that if I'm always going to want the next thing, then I need to start enjoying the journey, the process of doing it. So the other side, Jeff, is I had to get behind the idea of loving doing interviewing. And I think if you love doing interviewing, you're there to hear that natural answer in the moment. And then you don't force yourself to be stuck in your head. So I hope that answers the question. But practicing, I think mindfulness is one way to sort of be in the moment.
100% agree with you on that. I don't know if we talked about this when we talked, but I've had a meditation practice for, I think, well over 20 years. I think 23 years now.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Do you take notes? Because I'm like, you might see me looking down and writing. Every time I do one of these, I am like writing. I usually end up with 3 or 4 pages of notes. And often I'm writing down like, oh, that was something that just spurred a thought. I'm going to come circle back to this.
Yeah.
Do you do that a lot?
I do. I wouldn't say I do it every interview, but I have like my notebook right here, and it's the one I would do it in. It's right here. And I basically, if I'm doing an interview, now the interesting part is I'm using it as a blank page, meaning it's not very organized or systemized when I do it, but like I'll write down a trigger word that reminds me, okay, I want to ask them about this. Oh, they just said that. I better ask them about that. But it goes to your point. That's another way to not be in your head thinking about the next question is I'll just write it down quickly. And it's enough for me to remember what I wanted to ask. And that allows me to not stay in my head because now it's on paper and I know I won't forget it. So like, if it's a new question that just came into my mind, I'm like, ooh, I've never asked that question before. I need to ask that. And let's say it was about, I'm just talking an example. Well, I'll go, since I said it earlier, let's say it was the stand-up comedy. And you said, oh, I perform stand-up comedy Second City. So I'm going to write stand-up comedy Second City. And that just tells me I'm going to come back to that question. And probably where I got that from is when I performed stand-up, I'd write down like 5 words and then I'd memorize them. And all I needed to know, so this is going to sound weird, but I had this one bit about me going on a date with a girl that leaned over and told me that she had scurvy. And it was just fascinating to me because I was like, who's had scurvy in the 21st century? And so, but I called that joke Scurvy Girl. So all I needed to remember was 5 things like that, Scurvy Girl, and then I'd have Dog's View. And like I had those 5 things, and that's how I remember my whole set in comedy. And so it's the same type of thing. I'll make these notes in a journal, and because I'm used to that shorthand, I can go and say, oh yeah. Because again, I have that great memory, so I could go, oh yeah, stand-up comedy. I want to ask Jeff about that. And then I'll stick to my plan and then circle back. So answer your question, yes, take notes. I do.
So how do you stay on the subject of staying in the moment? You've done live interviews with audiences and you've also done them with pre-recorded, right? And what is the difference when you're doing it live? And what do people need to know when you're going to go do an interview live versus pre-recorded?
Okay, so this is not the sexy answer. My initial original answer is think of every interview as live. So that's how I do it, because you truly never know, especially in our world today, right? Like you could be in a building, I'm just talking an example, but it could be a co-working space. And you could have somebody over in the corner and here's what you're saying. And, they want to record it or whatever. And you say something that you can't take back. Well, they now have it on recording. So I would just assume everything's live. So I tackle every interview as if it's live. And I even, if I'm going to say, for those listening that want to know about this, like I still talk as if we're live. Now, having said that, there obviously is a very big difference when you are live. One of the things that I've started doing a lot lately with our Blue Talks brand, and I get really excited about it, is we're already doing live events. So it's like TEDx meets Chicken Soup. So we're already there with a live audience in front of us. Well, I love the idea of live podcast interviews. So every event that I'm at that we do those, I usually schedule like 4 interviews. And so the difference there, to answer your question, Chris, again, it's for me at this point, it's not as much prep. But I'll get like the audience is in front of me and I'll start it out saying, it's so great to have a live audience here with us. And so I approach it like this is a live audience. And then as we're talking, I'll say now, I might even say, do we have any questions that you guys want to ask to Dave Hester while he's sitting up here and you watch Storage Wars and you're curious about that. So that in that case, I'm interacting with the audience. So it's more like a speech or talk where I'm actually interacting with the audience. That's to me, the biggest difference is just how I approach the person I'm talking to. But as far as showing up, I literally show up as if everything's live. I just did, and I will say some of them are more nerve-wracking than others because it's somebody that you grew up watching and you're like, how's this happening now? You're in the moment. So I mentioned Brian Austin Green. Well, I was a product of the 80s and 90s. So I watched Beverly Hills 90210 and Malibu Shores. And so I just did an interview in LA with Randy Spelling, which would be Tori Spelling's brother, and Brian Austin Green, again, from 90210 and Anger Management. And so we weren't live. We had take backs, but I was still maybe more nervous there than I was at certain live ones because these are people I, again, grew up watching. I'm like, how is this even a thing? Like I grew up in a small little PEI, as we talked about in Canada. And I was told growing up there, there's no route to Hollywood for us. There's no way to be in LA. And now I'm being interviewed by these 2 people I watched when I was a kid watching Beverly Hills. I know that was a tangent, but just to say I prepare for live and pre-record the same way. But I like what you guys did at the beginning, and I usually do that too, is I'll tell the guest, because me preparing is different than maybe somebody coming in and it's their first interview or they haven't done an interview of this capacity. I'll say, and just so you know, we're pre-recorded, so we have takebacks. That's the terminology I use. We have takebacks. And so from a guest point of view, I think it's still better to think that you're live, but the difference really is that when you're live, you need to be in the moment. You need to realize that what you say is going out to the world no matter what. Whereas pre-recorded, as we mentioned, you can think along the lines of, worst case scenario, if I forget to say something, Jeff and Chris might be nice enough to turn the camera back on for a minute or two and then put it back in later.
Do you have any other pre-interview rituals that really get you in the right state before going into an interview?
Yes, so I do. One of them is that again, if I mentioned I researched the person, let's just say it was Jack Canfield, Chicken Soup for the Soul. And if I have an audiobook of Jack's, I might listen to a bit of him just to get like in that energy, if you will. The other side of it, though, what I do typically before both speaking and interviews is I remind myself of a quote that somebody sent me or an email somebody sent me when they said, Corey, that thing you said about this changed my way of thinking. Or thank you for saying this. My mother went through that as well. And knowing, for example, it could be like I talk often about being an only child, and my mother was a single mother. And I might talk about how close we are now, but how it wasn't always like that. And, you know, I was a teenager fighting with her and stuff. And I didn't understand why she's doing it. And now I know why she did it. Well, I might have, and I have had this many times, somebody come up out of the audience or somebody tell me in an email, I'm a single mother as well, and I'm struggling with my kid right now. And it gives me so much hope to know you guys are so close, even though your mother didn't know what she was doing, if it was going to be good or you were going to hate her along the way. So I think about a comment like that. I'll call it a testimonial. I think about that before I go into everything. And what that does is it reminds me that that person, that next version of that person could be in my audience right now, whether it's a podcast or whether on a stage, that person could be in my audience. And this is my chance to reach them and have them have the same kind of impact. So I feel like that's a ritual. I used to meditate beforehand, but what I found is with the speaking side, when you meditate, usually, and Jeff, I know you do a lot of talks as well, you're sitting usually at the table with the main people running the event. And what I found is when I used to go meditate, they would start getting panicked. Where did he go? And if I tried to tell them, they didn't fully understand what I'm talking about. This was, pre when we talked about meditation as often, because I've been speaking for over 20 years. And so I would disappear and they're like, oh my God, did he leave? What happened? And so I found I couldn't do that. So what I did instead, eventually, as I started changing it, so I would go stand at the side of the stage. And as they were saying my bio, that's when I would think about this testimonial. And I would say, that person's going to be out there today. I know it. And I want to impact their life. And I found that got me on the stage, not in my head, not thinking about me, not thinking about what could go wrong. It was literally about, now I realize I'm here to impact somebody else.
In business, a lot of people tend to fail forward. They figure things out through their failures, and failure is really just a lesson, right? So I wanted to ask you, what was an interview you felt like you learned a valuable lesson through failure?
There's a few that come to my head right away, and one of them, I won't say the person's name because it wasn't a great interview experience. And sometime I'll tell you both off air because I think you probably know the person. But basically, I interviewed somebody very direct and to the point person. He's a speaker who's very much like, if your check doesn't clear, this isn't going to be my best talk. Like that type of thing, like very blunt. And we got on the interview, and I was a fan of this person. He has 2 books that I read. I subscribed to them. I actually used them in building my business, my speaking business. And so I was super stoked. And I got on the interview, and I said, like I kind of do usually, is I said, hey, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself? And he said, I think if they're listening, they already know who I am. And it just kind of went like, energy just went bad right away. And then he's like, this seems like kind of pointless. You asking me a question like that to start it out. And he wouldn't let it go either. And so it was about 5 minutes of this discussion. And I just said, I kind of feel like the energy isn't right for us to even do this interview. And he goes, I agree. See ya. And so that was an interesting one. Now, what I learned from it, because after that, I started kind of doing what we do as speakers. One person out of 1,000 said, oh, Jeff, you should change this. And I'm not saying you do this, but I did it early on. The first couple of years, I'd be like, maybe they're right. Maybe I should change this. And then I have to remind myself to go back and look at the 999 said, I like you because you're super passionate. Forget the one that said you're too passionate, but I would get stuck in that. So with him, for a little bit, Chris, I started going, maybe I should stop asking that. Maybe I should read a bio like this. But I found out most of the people I brought on didn't want that. And so what I learned is to listen to the many, not the one in this kind of circumstance. Sometimes you should listen to the one, but in this circumstance, listen to the many because they were saying, no, I like your style. That's why I come to you. It's different. And so that's one. I had another one where I learned that just because the person is excited to tell you this stuff doesn't mean it'll ever air. A fiddler, this will probably narrow it down for people. A fiddler in the East Coast in Canada, I interviewed him and he told me a lot about parties that they went to and stuff he did at those parties. And we were going to put him on the front cover of a book I was writing, which was like there were 9 people from the region on the book. And yeah, his publicist called me after and said, he told us what he told you. Can you please never run that interview? and so, that was another one. And then one I can say, because there's nothing really wrong with this, but Marianne Williamson, I interviewed a number of years ago, and her team didn't send me a copy of the book, and she thought they probably did because it was a new book coming out. And so we had to stop the interview because she said, did they send you the book? Because she realized my talking points weren't on target with the book's release. And so she said, should we just coop and you come back after you read the book? And I know one thing. I know from doing this long enough, if you miss that one interview, if you cancel that and it took you 4 months to get it, it might never happen again. So I said, you know what? Let's, I'll stop the recording. And we weren't live again, so we had to take back. I said, can you give me just 2 minutes of what you want me to cover and I'll make it work? And she said, oh, sounds good. And we did it and it went fine. But to go back to the point, Chris, those are some of the things I learned. Like, for example, be flexible. Be flexible with that Marianne interview. Not be so tied to the interview that you lose track of doing the interview and why you're doing it. So, for example, the fiddler, it could have been easy for me to beat myself up and say, well, maybe I shouldn't let him go there, and maybe I should have checked beforehand. But again, I feel it becomes one of those stories that actually it's a great story. It actually turned into a great story, and the interview will never air, and I'm okay with that. And then the other guy, I think I learned, cut your losses. Like, he was angry from the first minute. It was a bad energy from the first minute. No matter what I do, I'm not going to fix this interview in real time. And I just moved on. And also, again, didn't hold it against him. That's who he is. And I should have figured that out from his books. But I also knew we aren't a good synergy because I'm a pretty chill guy and he's not a chill guy. So hopefully that gives people some takeaways. Flexibility, be in the moment. Don't be too tied to a question or the interview, and be willing to cut your losses if you know when it's a real no.
How about backup systems? Like, I'm sure you've had interviews like where the recording didn't work or you forgot to hit record. And because I know that has happened to me. And I also know that when that happens, the second time you do let's redo that, the energy is just it's just never the same. Asking those same questions. So do you use, because I heard you mentioned Tim Ferriss earlier, and I've heard him talk about having like triple backup system or 3 different systems he's using to record. And I'm like, well, that seems like a little over the top, but I also have felt that pain of losing an interview.
Yeah. So I know the 2 interviews that I've lost. Literally, I mean, again, you guys have probably figured out, I seem to have for whatever reason, I was gifted this memory. So I remember specific things about everything almost. And so first part to the answer is usually for interviews that I'm doing when I'm interviewing somebody else, if I'm in person, because that happens, and I'm recording, let's say from phones, I have 2 literally, and that's why I have them. I can show people in real time. Well, this one's plugged in, but I have 2 phones, both the exact same phone, iPhones, for a reason. I have 2 mics, and so I literally mic us both. So we both have similar quality recording. That's in person. When we're doing it for our live events I mentioned, we have redundancy systems. Everybody has 2 mics on. But the more common situation that I'm in is recording, let's say, via Zoom or Riverside or StreamYard. And so what I do, which is not optimal or ideal, but I'll have a mic hooked up to my phone recording while I'm recording on Zoom. Now, the other thing, and this is how I lost these 2 interviews. Well, sorry, I should say I think it is. But the other thing I do is I make sure that my Zoom, no matter what call I'm on, always starts recording. Every blue moon, I'll have somebody saying, why are you recording our conversation? Because it's maybe a sales call or what have you. But I always have it on record. And that way I know it's not going to be me having to remember it every time. So I would call that's sort of my redundancy system. It automatically records. And then I do a second copy of it one way, shape, or form. For interest sake, the 2 interviews that I lost, one was with Larry Winget. And I don't know if you guys know Larry Winget, the world's first irritational speaker. He was on Larry King a bunch of times, and he's got a bunch of books like You're Broken, It's Your Own Fault, and I Can Prove It. He's really that kind of guy. And used to smoke the cigars on stage, cowboy boots. So Larry Winget, and then I mentioned John earlier, John Lee Dumas. Now I've done probably 7-8 interviews with John. I lost 1. And John always does 15-minute increments. So it was like a short interview. And Larry, I did it. It was my first ever interview with him, and I lost it. And that's when I started setting the record on automatically. The part is, I'm sure still to this day I recorded it, and I don't know where the Zoom thing went. It was like it went into the ether. But here's what's really cool. I never knew if I'd get a chance at a do-over with Larry. I knew I would with John. And I never told Larry, by the way. This is the first time I'm ever saying this on anything. Same with John. I don't think I told him. But what I did with Larry, I reached back out years later, maybe 2 years later, and I ended up doing an interview with him. And in the interview, he said, just so you know, this is the last interview I'm ever doing in my life, so I'm going to say whatever the heck I want to. And so in some ways, being able to do somebody's last interview who's probably done 5,000 interviews, that's pretty cool. And so I feel like I got my do-over with Larry. And then John, I probably interviewed him 3 more times since. But yes, Jeff, I've lost interviews. There's a pain in that. Like, still to this day, now this is, I'm saying conservatively 7 years ago, still to this day, every now and then I go to my hard drives and I'll go to my old computer and still type in Larry Winget, just in case somehow the universe didn't search it properly, even though I went file by file. I've tried so many ways. I went to zoom.us and went down everything I could. Yeah, it's frustrating. And so I recommend everybody has a do-over. And another thing I learned is, even if you plan to only use audio, record video. So when I first started, I'd record only audio. And then years later, I started doing a video show, and I'm like, oh my gosh, all of that footage that I lost. Like, I've done interviews with T. Harv Eker and Michael Gerber before I did video, and they said some nice things about me. And I'm like, that's a great testimonial. But now I have to show a photo of Michael Gerber and him saying, Corey, you're a delight. You know, and like, but seeing him saying it verbally would have been more powerful. So what I would say is, assume you're going to use the video down the road, even if you never use the video. So those are some maybe little things I wish I would have known when I started.
What do you think, Jeff? Should we do some tacos?
Yeah, we could go to taco questions. These are probably questions you haven't heard before, Corey.
Yeah. This is these are, well, just so you know what we're doing here. This is our 2-minute taco break. All right. And this is where we get to ask you some taco related questions. They start off mild and they get steadily spicier as we get into them. All right. And so the first question we always ask is, are you onto hard shells or soft shell tacos?
Hard shells.
Nice. We got so many hard shell people this year. This is awesome.
This has been a hard shell season.
As a hard shell fan, I appreciate this season. This has been great. All right. What about mild, medium, or spicy tacos?
At most, medium, but I would say I would lean toward mild.
And are you pro guacamole or no guacamole?
I'm pro guacamole. I was always no guacamole until about a year ago.
Nice. All right, well, let's get into some spicier questions here. If you could eat tacos with any famous interviewer, alive or dead, who would you want to do that with?
Interviewer. Wow. I should go with my first instinct. I think that's the way to go. My first gut, which is Larry King.
Why Larry King? Because I could probably guess, but why for you is Larry King important?
I feel like he was the interviewer's interviewer. And one of the things that Larry did, which there's always a balancing act for me, but he really made it about the guest. So like, he was he always had those cue cards he read from, which I thought was, I've never done that, but I thought that was fascinating. That's how much research he did. And he always had those cue cards. He always leaned in. He felt like he was trying to make the guest the star. And he had the opportunity to interview almost everybody. So part of why I would want to sit with him is to pick his brain. What you're asking me about, what was a favorite interview, fascinating interviews, what went wrong, all those kind of things. I would love to ask him, what was your backup plan? Did you guys have a backup plan back then? And so I think it's just, I'd love to pick his brain about why he did what he did and what he learned from it, and, what he would do over, and what were some of the fascinating interviews he did, and that kind of thing.
Well, if you found a taco that was magical and took you back in time, what would you say to your teenage self?
Oh, wow. So I've only had the question. I shared this. I was on ABC in New York last week, and the interviewer asked me this question, and I said, what's so fascinating to me is I think I've been asked this 3 times, and I've asked it thousands. So to you guys, congrats and kudos, because again, 3 times in almost 20 years, I've been asked a similar question to this. And the one challenge I have, I feel, is I'm kind of jaded because I know what most people would say, meaning I've heard the answer so many times that what I wonder, I think I would still answer the exact same. But what I wonder is, would I, if I didn't know what I knew? Now, I didn't have to go that deep into it. But what I would say, I think I would say, I know now it's what I would do, but I would either do one of two things. If you said, gun to your head, you need to get in that machine and you need to go back and talk to your younger self, then I would say, hey, pal, I just want to say hi and say you're doing a great job. Don't change a single thing. If I had the choice, I don't know that I would get in the time machine. So interestingly, I would get in a time machine and go back to another time period in time, let's say Woodstock or what have you. I would go back in another period of time if I knew it wouldn't affect who I am today. In terms of what I would say to my younger self, like I said, if I had to go back, I would just say, high five, bud. I just want to tell you, you're doing a great job. Just keep doing it. And please don't change one single thing. And you probably see why I'm saying that if you believe in the butterfly effect.
All right. And now I have one more that is, I think you'll also recognize, but I put my own spin on it here for tacos. But you're basically in line at a taco shop. All right. And it's lined up around the block because this place is so good. And while you're in line, the person next to you asks you for some life advice. What would you say? And what hot sauce would you recommend them to get?
So now when you say hot sauce, do you mean brand or how hot or mild or?
I would say a brand is my preferred answer. Yeah.
You know what? I have to think about what. Oh, Frank's. Is it Frank's?
Frank's is a great one. Yeah.
So I would probably recommend Frank's to them, but I've tried it and I have a tougher time because I'm not a super spicy person, but that's the one I'd recommend. And that's the power of branding, right? Because I've heard that name so many times. I'm like, it's got to be good, even to people that don't like sort of the spicy ones. As far as what I would say to that person standing in line is, so what I have to go to, I always try to go to instinct. So I've done all these interviews, and I've been, one of the things I did as a talk for years was called the Timeless Secrets of Influential Leaders. And basically it's because what I've discovered are the common secrets and traits are actually very on brand with what Napoleon Hill discovered all those years ago. So what that tells me is they're timeless. And so having said that, the most common thing I've discovered, which is kind of interesting because Napoleon Hill's first chapter, I believe, is on desire. So similar to what we would call passion today, and so what I've discovered is the most common thing that the top influencers share is that they've discovered their purpose and they live on purpose. So you could call it meaning, passion. Like I think passion is what you do, like podcasting. Purpose is why you're doing it. So they've discovered their purpose, and it's so powerful that I call it vitamin P. So I say it's the vitamin you can take every day, but you'll never buy in a store. And it's the one vitamin that can change everything because if you talk to people that have purpose in their life, they're happier. They wake up every morning usually excited to take on the day. People like being around them more often. And I won't go down this whole path, but the Blue Zones has showed that the number one thing that the top longest living and happiest people have in common is they have meaning in their life. That's the only one that overlaps between the two Blue Zone studies. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. That whole book is about how he survived the Holocaust because he had meaning in his life. So because of that, and because it's the number one thing I discovered that most influencers have in common, what I would tell that person in his line is we need to help you, or you need to spend the time finding a passion that will reveal a purpose to you. I feel if it's the number one, that's the one we got to go to, right? And it's, by the way, it's like 98% of the people that I've interviewed have found meaning in their life.
Thank you for indulging me with the 2-minute taco break. I think we got some great gold out of those taco questions.
Corey, what question haven't we asked you that we should ask you?
Wow.
About interviewing.
Oh, about interviewing. Okay. Because that's a different thing from interviewing versus my life. You know what? I would say, because it depends, because I know we're trying to talk more for the people when they're doing the interview, when they're conducting, what have you. But one question that I get asked not all the time, but somewhat often, but I think it's an important question, is how do you schedule the interviews in the first place? So how do you get the attention of a big name thought leader? Like, what is it, just magic? Like, or is it just that you got lucky, or how do you do that? I think that's a really big one. And I mean, if you're okay with me tackling that one, I can tell you really quick.
Yeah.
That'd
So
be great.
honestly, first of all, I often talk about what I call the domino effect. So I always say it's a reverse domino. The biggest one is the hardest one to push over. And so just like that, I say if you're trying to reach an influencer, convince them to come on your show, the hardest one is always going to be the first one. So you might have to run and jump against that domino to knock it over, to knock the next one over. And so first of all, it's just recognizing it's going to be hard, but it's going to get easier. So what I did is the first one for me was Jack Canfield. And what's fascinating to me about that interview is that I had no listeners. I hadn't launched yet. And I was going to his team. And, this is at a time Jack's doing Larry King Live. Super Soul Sunday with Oprah. And here goes this guy from a small town, no listeners. But I didn't focus on the no listeners because they asked that less often back then. And he wasn't doing podcasts either. But what I did was, so this is, I guess, a sort of a hack for how I got the interview, but it ties into what I recommend people do. And so they told me, Corey, it's probably going to be a no. I still have this interview. He's turning down 9 out of every 10 interviews because he has nothing to promote. And I thought, okay, how can I be creative? And to make a long story very short, I reached out once a month for 3 months. And then I said, you know what I need to do? I need to find out who I can get to that knows Jack, that will say Jack should be on your show. So, and you'll know this person, I'm sure, Jeff, but I did a little bit of research and I found a testimonial on Jack's website by a guy named Dan Sullivan, strategic coach. And so what I did was I went and found out where Dan was going to be that I could reach out. And so I noticed he was on the latest issue of Success Magazine with Darren Hardy. And this was back in the old CD days. I put it in, I listened to the interview, and I'm like, Darren interviews in a similar style to me. And at the end, Dan said, this was my favorite interview I've ever done in my life. So I took a clip of that and I took my own interview to show them that it was a similar style. And they said, I think you're right. Dan would like this show. Got Dan on the show, brought up Jack 3 or 4 times, just in casual. And it made sense because Dan did I forget what it's called, but he had the event that he did with his weekend where Joe Polish went and Mark and Jack both went every time. And so I brought up Jack in those ways. And Dan said, you know, Corey, Jack would love being in the show. And you tell him Dan said so. So I took that clip and I sent it to Jack's team, and their words were something like, Corey, you've beaten us into submission. Here's Jack's scheduling link. And then I did the interview, and to have a great close to the what happened as a result is the day it aired, because we used to interview every second Saturday. The day it aired, the day before he was on Larry King Live, and the day after he was on with Oprah on Super Soul Sunday. And in between, he was on my tiny show with no listeners. By the way, our first episode got 5,000 listeners. So we did actually bring the audience, but we never promised them we would. That leads into, to get the big name interviews, what I did was I went and found out somebody else he knew when I couldn't reach Jack. Got Dan on, and now here's what gets really cool. Now I could go to Mark Victor Hansen and say, you know, Mark, we've had Jack, your former writing partner, Dan, your coach, on the show. Would love to have you on the show. And if I remember correctly, Mark said something like, sure, I'd love to be on the show with my friends. I always thought that was a powerful line. And so we got Mark on, and now we have 3 people, and now I can go to somebody else who may not even be in their circle, and they're going, well, if the 2 guys from Chicken Soup and the Soul and Dan Sullivan already went on the show, we can trust this guy. And so you can see where it goes from there. It builds and builds. But I think the creativity now is, how do you reach them before somebody else? So one thing a person can do is go on, let's say, Amazon, and you can find coming soon, and you can go back to like 8 months in advance of a book being dropped and find out Matthew McConaughey has a book coming out in 8 months. Your best chance to reach him is before he scheduled all his interviews. So I think you need to go, as Ziglar used to say, dig your well before you're thirsty. Go start building the relationship before you need it. And so to me, those are some hacks. Find people that have endorsed them or that are in their circle, get access to them. Also, like I say, Amazon, go on to coming soon. Another thing I use is hunter.io. There's a lot of these sites, but hunter.io, you can go in and drop the website of the person. And what it'll do is it'll go back and see any email addresses it can find associated with that person across the web. So maybe they only ever put it on once and then never shared it again. And so I was at the VCon conference last year, and I wanted to interview people, and I found out the day before that we were allowed to reach out to the people. I thought we had to wait until they assigned them. And then I'm like, well, I don't have anything lined up. So I went into hunter.io and I popped in impact theory. And I was able to schedule an interview with Tom Bilyeu. And then I did the same with John Taffer from Bar Rescue. And so I ended up, and then the other one was Cesar Millan, so the dog whisperer. And that was all literally within 24 hours by popping the email. And what I did was I put it in hunter.io, I put the URL, and it came up with like 8 emails. And I didn't know who was who, and I only had a short amount of time. So I just literally sent it to all of them and said, not sure who I should reach out to about this, hoping you can redirect me. And so again, Jeff, I know that was a long tangent, but that's some of the hacks that I use to get those early interviews. And then when you have enough, then you can start leveraging those for other ones. And then also when you've done enough, you start getting clips of people saying, this was my favorite interview. And then you put together a little promo video and people watch that and jump in.
Yeah, there's so much in there. And I love just the audacity to be willing to go after those big people too, right? Like, even if you don't have the listeners, going after it. I think that's super inspirational for people. You know, this has been so great. And we call our podcast Dare to Launch because most of the people that are listening have something within them that they want to get out to the world. They may be in the process of figuring out their purpose, like what we talked about in this interview. And so I wanted to finish off this interview by asking you the question, why should people dare to launch?
really quickly, what we launched 4.5 years ago is a thing called Blue Talks. And I always say Blue is like chicken soup meets TEDx. So Blue stands for Business Life Universe. It's BLU. And I say if Chicken Soup and TEDx had a baby, we'd be the baby. And so why I launched this was back when I started as a speaker and author, what I found is, believe it or not, NBC didn't come knocking at my door. Believe it or not, I was told that if you build it, they will come, meaning the speaking business. And I always say now, I started building it, nobody even heard the hammer. And so getting in was really hard. And so what I said is, when I build this, over time, what I want to do is eventually be able to launch something that will allow me to get other people on stages. So, for example, put them on our stage, get them footage that they can leverage forever, get them the As Seen on banner, get them to become a best-selling author, get them to co-author a book with the late Bob Proctor. That's the newest one we're working on, with permission, of course. And I wanted to be able to get all this stuff for people so that they could leverage it forever. So you have a video on your site showing that you shared an event, spoke at an event at Columbia or MIT. And so that's what we built. And so we help people basically launch if they're an expert and they want to up level. And so for me, that tells you the why, why I care about this. So why I think people should dare to launch is because, honestly, you truly never know whose life you're going to impact. But at the same time, I call it the invisible impact. You are probably going to transform lives that you'll never even realize just by launching. So obviously there's the sexy reasons like make more money, maybe retire from your job. Or I know Jeff was working from home when he started, and eventually he was able to supplement that income that he used to have and go full time. So there's all those great things, time freedom, all the other reasons you would launch a business in the first place. But for me, what I think it's about is somebody is waiting to hear your message right now and desperately needs it. They're desperately waiting. And until you launch, they might never hear that message. So I think the reason that you should dare to launch is because you have the ability and potential with your message and story to impact countless lives that'll never be impacted if you don't launch.
Thank you so much, Corey, for jumping on our show today and rocking our world with all of that. And if people want to learn more from you and get to connect with what you're doing, how can they do that?
Well, I will say, I mentioned the Blue Talks just for a second, but if that's something that intrigues people, they're like, oh, I want to speak on bigger stages or more stages. I need somebody to help me launch, whatever that looks like for them, especially if they want to use their message to impact the world. If they wanted to do that, I would say just reach out, speakonblue.com, and that's BLU. So speakonblue.com. That's one place people can go. And then honestly, the other place I would say, if people want to learn more about me, it sounds like a crazy answer, but just Google my name and then find the social media links. I say that because, of course, I'm on 5 social medias, so I don't want to drop a whole bunch of links. Or they can go to CoreyPoirierMedia.com. That's the other option. So CoreyPoirierMedia.com is where my social links are. Or honestly, my name's so unique, it's not hard to find on Google, and you'll see all the links there as well.
And we'll have all that in the show notes as well for you, so you can check those out. And Launch Family, thanks again for listening, and we hope this conversation inspires you to dare to launch. Hey, Launch Family, one last thing before you go. If you haven't yet, go check out getyouLaunch.com. We actually have some really great free resources for anyone who's looking to get your business launched. So go to getyouLaunch.com, sign up with your email, and we'll send you out some free training. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time.